Night settles over the Pacific like a sheet of black steel. The horizon is gone, swallowed by cloud and moonless dark. Only the faint hum of engines breaks the silence as a lone American bomber, lumbering, overworked, and carrying a crew that hasn't slept in 20 hours, pushes through the void on its return leg. Inside the cabin, red lamps glow against exhausted faces. Sweat clings to the metal walls. Every man knows they are vulnerably alone. Then the radio crackles. Not with a message, with static, sharp, rising, and unnatural. The radar operator looks up first. His voice tightens. There are shapes behind them. Many shapes. 14 Japanese fighters, fast, climbing, converging. The kind of overwhelming swarm that tears bombers apart in seconds. Every crewman braces for the attack he knows he cannot survive. But the pilot does something no one expects. He pulls the aircraft into a maneuver so aggressive, so counter to every manual and every instinct, that his own men believe he has lost his mind. Yet in the next minute, that impossible move will stop 14 attackers cold and change everything. In mid-1943, the air war over the Southwest Pacific was a brutal contest of endurance. The Solomon Islands campaign had become a grinding struggle of reconnaissance flights, interdiction raids, and fighter sweeps as Allied forces fought to isolate the major Japanese base at Rabaul. Every mile of sky between New Guinea and Bougainville was contested, and every aircraft that crossed it did so knowing rescue was unlikely if something went wrong. For General George Kenney's 5th Air Force, long-range photographic intelligence was the backbone of the campaign. Targets were hidden beneath jungle canopy, Japanese airfields shifted rapidly, and naval units moved daily between island anchorages. The only way to keep pace was to send reconnaissance bombers, mostly B-17s and B-24s, stripped or modified, hundreds of miles behind enemy lines to photograph positions no fighter escort could reach. Those flights were the most dangerous missions of the theater. Japanese Zero units based at Buka, Kahili, and Balale had earned a fierce reputation for aggressive intercepts. Reconnaissance crews knew the routine. Once detected, they would face multiple passes from veteran pilots whose aircraft were faster, lighter, and built for the kill. There was no margin for error at altitude ranges where weather, fuel, and fatigue pressed from all sides.
Among these crews was the group manning a heavily modified B-17E nicknamed Old 666, a battered airframe that had become both a workhorse and a magnet for trouble. His crew had a reputation for taking the missions others avoided: long-range flights, deep penetrations, routes no one else wanted. His men trusted his skill, but not always his judgment. And on June 16, 1943, that judgment would be tested as the crew approached Bougainville, where the skies were about to erupt. Old 666 was unlike any other B-17 in the theater. It had been patched together from damaged airframes, reinforced with extra armor plates, and fitted with far more guns than standard configuration allowed. Ziemer and his crew had turned it into a flying fortress in the truest sense. 17 guns in total, many repositioned or improvised, all maintained obsessively for the missions no one else volunteered to fly. The crew reflected the aircraft, unconventional, stubborn, and fiercely capable. Staff Sergeant Joseph Joe Sarnowski, the bombardier and top turret gunner, was considered one of the finest aerial marksmen in the Pacific. Lieutenant Ruby Johnston, navigator, handled charts and cameras on missions that pushed aircraft to the edge of their fuel limits. Erickson, Vaughn, Abel, Ziemer's gunners, each carried battle scars and the calm intensity of men who had survived more intercepts than they cared to count. In early June 1943, Allied command needed detailed reconnaissance photos of Japanese positions around Buin on the southern tip of Bougainville. Fighters based at Kahili Airfield made the area deadly. Several crews had refused the mission outright. Others attempted partial runs and returned without complete imagery. The Japanese had strengthened their air defenses precisely because they knew these photographs would guide the coming landings. Ziemer accepted the mission without hesitation. The plan was simple on paper and dangerous in practice. Fly alone, at low altitude, over heavily defended territory, photograph multiple targets, and escape before enemy fighters could converge. But Old 666 was detected earlier than expected, and by the time the crew turned inland to begin filming, radar and lookouts on Bougainville had already alerted several Zero units. The trap was closing, and the men aboard Old 666 felt it tightening with every mile. Every man aboard Old 666 knew the risks long before they crossed the Bougainville coastline.
Reconnaissance missions offered none of the offensive satisfaction of bombing runs, and none of the protection provided by large formations. Crews flew alone, exposed and outnumbered. Yet Ziemer's team developed a rare cohesion, a bond born not from comfort, but from repeated brushes with death. They had survived damaged engines, fuel shortages, and aggressive intercepts that would have broken less seasoned crews. Ziemer's leadership played a crucial role. He was not a conventional officer. He avoided ceremony, wore his uniform casually, and earned the nickname the Madman for flying too low, too deep, or too long into enemy territory. But he inspired trust by competence. His decisions were sharp, his flying instinctive, and his calm under fire had saved the crew more than once. When he accepted the Bougainville mission, they followed not because it was safe, but because they trusted him with their lives. The B-17 was designed for high-altitude, formation-based bombing. Alone at low altitude, it was a vulnerable target. Yet Old 666 had been prepared specifically for missions like this. The crew had repositioned machine guns to create overlapping firing arcs that covered nearly every approach except directly below. The side and tail guns had increased fields of fire, and the nose guns, usually weak on B-17s, had been strengthened to counter head-on attacks, the preferred method of experienced Zero pilots. Ziemer understood that survival depended on eliminating blind spots and forcing attackers to break off after one pass. A lone B-17 could not outrun fighters. It could only make each attack so costly that interceptors hesitated or misjudged their approach. Every man on Old 666 trained to shift fire, conserve ammunition, and communicate threats rapidly. These preparations would prove crucial when the Japanese fighters finally struck. At the heart of the mission were the bulky reconnaissance cameras bolted into the B-17's fuselage. They required stable, straight-line flight during exposures, exactly the opposite of what survival demanded under attack. To complete the run, the aircraft had to maintain altitude and heading long enough to capture clear, usable images of the Buin airfields and fortifications. Even minor turbulence or evasive maneuvers risked blurring the photographs and rendering the mission pointless. This technological limitation placed Ziemer in a brutal dilemma: protect the aircraft by maneuvering, or protect the mission by flying straight.
The cameras needed minutes. The enemy fighters would be on them in seconds. The tension between these two demands shaped what followed. It forced a choice no pilot wanted to make, and one his crew initially believed was suicidal. As the coastline of Bougainville slipped beneath their wings and the cameras began clicking, the first specks of approaching fighters appeared on the horizon. The Japanese units stationed at Kahili and Balalay were not inexperienced rookies. Many were hardened veterans from earlier campaigns across the Pacific, pilots who had mastered coordinated interception tactics. Their Mitsubishi A6M0s excelled in climb rate, maneuverability, and acceleration, qualities that made them lethal against isolated bombers. From their vantage point, a lone B-17 cruising over Bougainville was an opportunity. It was slow, predictable during photographic runs, and vulnerable from head-on and low-side approaches. As alerts spread across the Japanese airfields, multiple Zero flights scrambled. Their objective was simple: destroy the reconnaissance aircraft before it could escape with intelligence that would expose defensive positions. 14 fighters in total began converging, guided by radio and visual sightings. To them, this was not merely an intercept, it was a tactical necessity to protect the secrecy of upcoming operations. Reconnaissance crews lived in a mental space few others understood. Their missions demanded discipline under extreme vulnerability. They were expected to fly straight when instinct screamed to evade. Ziemer's crew faced this conflict acutely. As the cameras continued their work and the Zero formation tightened its approach, the men had to decide whether to urge their pilot to break off. Every second they delayed evasive action increased their danger. But Ziemer had established a culture of mission-first thinking. The crew believed in the value of the photographs, intelligence that would shape upcoming landings, save infantry lives, and disrupt Japanese logistics. They also understood that survival meant middle if the mission failed. Still, the psychological strain was immense. Holding fire too early risked wasting ammunition. Firing too soon risked drawing premature attention. Balancing survival and duty required a clarity that only hardened crews possessed. As the Zeros drew into formation for coordinated passes, the cameras still needed seconds the crew did not have. They watched the film counter tick down, knowing each frame could influence a coming offensive. The aircraft trembled from distant gunfire as the fighters opened at long range. In that moment, the final photographs were captured. But the crew understood the price. The Zeros were now close enough to begin their full attack. And Zemer was about to make the decision that would define the battle. The first attack came from above and ahead, classic Zero tactics. 4 fighters dove in a shallow arc, guns flickering in the morning haze, aiming to rake Old 666 from nose to tail. The crew braced as tracers ripped through the air, stitching lines across the sky. Sarnowski in the nose turret opened up first, firing in controlled bursts that forced the lead Zero to break early. But the others pressed on, slashing toward the bomber with lethal intent. Rounds punched through the fuselage. Oxygen lines snapped. Glass shattered. Those words changed everything. The Japanese fighters were now within seconds of their next coordinated pass. They would come from multiple angles, high, low, front, and tail, to overwhelm every defensive position. Standard doctrine for a B-17 in this situation was to dive, turn hard, and disrupt the attacker's firing geometry. But Zemer did the opposite. He pushed the control column forward and rolled the massive bomber into a maneuver no one expected, a descending, corkscrewing turn so steep it threatened to rip the wings from the aircraft. It was a move fighter pilots used, not bomber crews. The gunners shouted warnings. For a moment, even the most experienced men aboard believed the pilot had finally snapped. Yet there was method beneath the madness. By banking hard into the oncoming fighters, Zemer forced the Zeros to overshoot their attack runs. Instead of presenting the broad, vulnerable profile of a turning bomber, Old 666's maneuver narrowed the angles of approach and forced the fighters into crossing patterns that disrupted their coordination. Their carefully arranged attack collapsed into chaos. The crew saw it instantly. Fighters streaked past out of position, gunners scrambled to reacquire targets, and the formation fractured. But the maneuver had a cost. It placed the bomber at point-blank range for the next wave. And the Japanese were already adjusting for their second, deadlier attack. The second wave struck with ferocity. 5 Zeros swept in from the rear quarter, the angle they knew was most difficult for a B-17 to defend.
Their cannons opened at close range, and the tail of Old 666 erupted in sparks and flying metal. Vaughn and Abel fired back in overlapping arcs, their guns hammering so violently the mounts shook loose from their bolts. 1 Zero burst into flames and spiraled downward, but the others kept coming. A sudden impact rocked the bomber. Another fighter had made a head-on pass, its shells tearing through the nose compartment. Sarnowski was hit. Bleeding heavily, he collapsed over his gun, then dragged himself back up using the damaged frame. With one arm, barely conscious, he resumed firing. His burst struck a Zero attempting another frontal attack. The fighter snapped sideways and plunged toward the jungle below. In the cockpit, Zemer had taken multiple hits as well. A fragment ripped into his leg. Another lodged near his ribs. He refused to relinquish the controls. Old 666 was losing altitude, dropping toward the coastline it had crossed minutes earlier. Warning lights flashed across the panel. Hydraulics, oxygen, fuel. But Zemer kept the bomber in the same spiraling defensive arc, using every ounce of energy to deny the fighters a stable firing line. The Japanese regrouped for one final coordinated pass. 4 Zeros lined up off the right wing, determined to finish the kill. Their engines roared as they closed in. But the crew was ready. All guns on the starboard side, waist, top turret, cheek, opened simultaneously. The overlapping fire shredded the lead attacker and forced the others to break formation. 2 dove away trailing smoke. The last veered off sharply, unwilling to face that concentrated wall of fire. And suddenly, the sky was empty. The swarm had broken. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. Fuel was dangerously low. The crew was wounded, the pilot bleeding heavily, and the aircraft torn open in multiple sections. Yet Old 666 was still flying, and the Japanese fighters had disengaged. Now the battle shifted to survival, getting the crippled bomber home. Silence settled over the bomber, broken only by the rattling of loose metal and the strained hum of damaged engines. Smoke drifted through the fuselage. Blood pooled on the floor around the gun stations. The men moved with the slow, deliberate motions of shock, checking wounds, sealing holes, kicking out shattered glass. For a moment, none of them fully understood what had happened. 14 fighters had attacked. 14 had failed.
but the price was visible everywhere.
Sarnowski, who had forced himself upright to fire those final bursts, finally collapsed. His crewmates pulled him away from the wrecked nose compartment, but the wounds were too severe. The answer was yes, the film was intact. Ziemer refused medical attention. He remained at the controls, pale and shaking, his flight suit soaked with blood. The cockpit was riddled with holes, and his side ached with every breath, but he kept the bomber steady. Several control cables were damaged, forcing him to muscle the aircraft through every adjustment. Johnston and the others tried to help, but the B-17 needed a pilot's hands, his hands. The nearest Allied field was hundreds of miles away. A return over open ocean with failing engines was a gamble in itself, but turning back was the only option. Now came the longest part of the mission, surviving the flight home so the photographs could reach intelligence officers waiting in New Guinea. When Old 666 finally crossed into Allied airspace, it was barely holding together. Ground crews watching from the strip at Dobodura saw a bomber so riddled with holes, it seemed impossible it had stayed airborne. One engine failed on approach, another sputtered out moments later. Ziemer kept the aircraft level until the wheels touched dirt, then his strength finally gave way, and the crew pulled him from the seat. Medical officers were stunned he had remained conscious for the return flight. Sarnowski did not survive his wounds, but his final defense of the nose compartment was recorded in every after-action report. His sacrifice, and Ziemer's leadership, became defining elements of the mission. The photographs they brought back were immediately processed. The images revealed detailed positions of Japanese anti-aircraft guns, supply dumps, and fighter dispersal areas around Buin and Kahili. Allied planners used this intelligence to refine bombing routes and prepare for future operations tied to the isolation of Rabaul. Several officers later noted that without the clarity of those images, losses during subsequent attacks on Bougainville could have been far higher. For their actions, Captain J. Ziemer Jr. and Technical Sergeant Joseph Sarnowski were each awarded the Medal of Honor, the only time in the war that both a pilot and a bombardier from the same mission received the nation's highest decoration. The rest of the crew earned Distinguished Service Crosses.
The mission became a case study in 5th Air Force, proof of what a single aircraft could achieve when necessity, training, and sheer will converged in the most hostile skies of the Pacific. And in those torn photographs, commanders saw the cost and value of bravery under impossible odds. In the stillness after battle, the story of Old 666 is more than a tale of survival. It is a testament to human ingenuity, courage, and the razor-edge balance between risk and duty. Captain Ziemer's maneuver, initially dismissed by his crew as madness, revealed a principle that would resonate throughout the war. Sometimes unconventional thinking is the only path to survival. It was a moment where instinct, experience, and sheer audacity converged, allowing one crew to defy the odds and turn potential annihilation into achievement. The mission also illustrates the intimate connection between technology and human decision-making. Cameras and guns, charts and throttles, all required mastery under pressure. The B-17, normally a lumbering high-altitude bomber, became an instrument of precise survival, wielded not by doctrine, but by understanding and adaptability. Every bolt, every gun mount, every frame of film mattered. And yet, the human cost was undeniable. Joseph Sarnowski's sacrifice reminds us that heroism in war carries permanent weight. His determination ensured the mission's success, even as it claimed his life. The photographs returned that day did more than guide air campaigns. They preserved lives and reshaped strategy, proving that intelligence and bravery can shift the tides of battle. In the end, Old 666 and her crew stand as a stark reminder. In war, survival is as much about audacity and skill as it is about numbers and firepower. One moment of decisiveness can stop 14 attackers cold and echo through history long after the guns have fallen silent.